Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. I've just admitted 58 people at once, so I'll give it a second before I formally say hello and welcome whilst everyone's just joining and connecting. And there'll probably be a few people joining just a few seconds late. Sorry to keep you waiting just 1 minute. We're waiting on one member of our panel who's logging in as we speak, so they'll be here in just a second. But we'll kick off. So good afternoon, firstly, and thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to today's Athlete Genome webinar. It's co-hosted, as you know, between British Triathlon and Accenture. To introduce myself, I'm Stuart Searle. I'm part of the team at British Triathlon. I work on the partnership with Accenture, and I'm delighted to be hosting the call today. So I'll kind of take you through how it's going to work and then lead the session and go from there. So I'm going to introduce a few guests that comprise our panel today in just a moment, but I just wanted to firstly, sorry for the slightly soppy bit, but it would be remiss of me not to take the opportunity to say thank you to all of you guys, not just for joining today, but for all of the kind of work and the representation that you guys are a part of with regards to British Triathlon and our age group team. I know that Linda Hayward, who's our head of age group operations, is immensely proud of her role and of the team as a whole, as are the rest of us at British Triathlon, and indeed Accenture as our official age group partner, amongst the other designations they have as our official lead partner as well. So just wanted to kick off by saying thank you for being such great advocates of the sport as a whole. Sorry for a bit of a boring bit, but I'm sure you guys have been on many Zoom calls over the last few months. So I'm going to do a bit of what I used to call housekeeping, would now call Zoom keeping. I'm going to keep you all muted if that's okay, just with such a large number of people on the call. It just makes it a little bit easier to host, especially the first bit of the session. So when we get to the Q&A at the end of the session, I will ask you to kind of identify yourself if you want to ask any questions, and then unmute you specifically to ask it, if that's okay. If when we get to that part of the session you guys don't feel comfortable actually asking the question yourself, or you want me to read it for you, then you can put it into the chat function, which you'll find in the bar at the bottom, and I will happily read your question for you. The only other thing to make you aware of is that we are recording the call today, and so we'll be sharing some snippets of the call and some of the key insights with all of you guys and the rest of the age group audience after we're done today. The other thing I wanted to just mention is that in the chat box right now, I've just put an email address, which is triathlon@accenture.com. So any queries or any questions that you have today that you don't want to ask in front of everyone, then you're more than welcome to submit them to that email address and the team will come back to you. So moving on to the agenda for today, I'm going to introduce and then have a chat with our panel today. So I'll ask them to do a kind of formal in-depth introduction when I ask them the first question, but if I can just ask them to identify themselves and say hello quickly, and then we'll get on with it. So Charlie, do you want to reveal yourself and say hello to everyone?
Hi there. So if you can hear me, Charlie Wiseman. I'm a managing director with Accenture, and essentially I'm the executive sponsor of the Athlete Genome work that we're doing as part of our innovation work with British Triathlon. So really delighted to be here today and have the opportunity to talk to you. So many thanks in advance for your time. My role essentially is to set the general vision and direction for the Athlete Genome tool, some of which you may have seen communicated already as part of the emails that went out in advance of this call.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And Mike Cavendish, same for you, please.
Hi everybody, again, hopefully you can hear me and I don't look too sweaty. I appear to be in the world's hottest room right now, so apologies if you see any beads of sweat going down my forehead. So yeah, I'm Mike, I'm the Performance Director at British Triathlon. Essentially that means I oversee all the preparation for the Olympic and Paralympic Games, the world-class programs for Olympic and Paralympics, and all of the staff that are there to try and maximise chances of winning medals at either the Olympics or Paralympic Games. So science, medicine, coaching, logistics, operations, pathways, anything related to the elite side of the sport and the games themselves falls under me.
Great, thank you, Mike. We do have one more member of our panel, but they seem to be having some technical difficulties and aren't actually on the call just yet. So what I'll do is, when they do log in, I will admit them and then get them to introduce themselves as well, if that's okay. But in the meantime,
no, sorry, Stu. I was gonna point out actually that hilariously, don't know how it's done it, but a much better looking double of myself is sitting roughly in the middle of my screen anyway. Dave, would you mind, Stu, if you can't, you won't recognise them, if you could unmute everyone just quickly, and Dave, if you were able to introduce yourself.
There we go, I have done that.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. As Charlie said, my name's David Fletcher. I'm based at Loughborough University. I'm a sport and performance psychologist, and my role spans research, teaching and consulting with athletes. My role in the project itself was to provide that psychological input, both in terms of the research evidence base and the rigour underpinning the project, but also the consultancy angle on that as well, in terms of how a psychologist would work with top-level triathletes and coaches, and how we can integrate the project into athletes' everyday training.
Lovely, thank you very much, David. Sorry, I didn't spot you there because your name is listed as the same as Charlie, hence the but I'm going to mute everyone again now, but David, I've made you a co-host. You'll be able to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Great, well thank you for introducing yourselves, everyone. So the first question really is about your involvement in the project. So Mike, I'll kick off with you. You mentioned you're the performance director responsible for our performance programme at British Triathlon. Can you tell us your role within the Athlete Genome project, please?
Yeah, so as I touched on earlier, science and medicine is one of the big areas of the service essentially that we provide to athletes on world-class programme who are aiming at Olympic and Paralympic Games. And within science and medicine, innovation is just one of those parts that we manage. And the Athlete Genome project essentially falls under the innovation sphere of work that really we do. And we've been involved right from the outset, really, because of the potential that the genome has to significantly impact on the way we go about training and competing with our elite athletes. I'll try not to go into too much detail now because I'm sure my colleagues will do a much better job of it than me. But in reality, we see it as a massive opportunity to really enhance, and as another piece in our athletes' toolkit, really, to make them better prepared and have more chances of winning medals at the Olympic and Paralympic Games.
Great, thank you. And Charlie, same, if not similar question to you as a representative from Accenture. What's your kind of direct involvement in the Athlete Genome project?
At the top, sorry, covered it a tiny bit at the top, forgot to unmute myself. But essentially, yeah, I'm leading the vision and direction of the Athlete Genome tool. And obviously we're working closely with British Triathlon on that. And essentially, it comes out of the opportunity to harness mindset as an input to better understanding and influencing positively athletic performance. And this, as I'm sure David Fletcher will go on to talk about in due course, is something that isn't being done at the moment at scale, certainly not the scale we're doing it here. So what we have taken is a very practical physical problem of how do I get faster, and trying to apply a data science lens to that. And of course, that is generally considered as the way forward in many areas, and I don't see this as any different.
Fantastic. And David, we've got the British Triathlon angle and the Accenture angle. As the only kind of external member on the project, in your role, how do you kind of influence the project?
Well, I became involved around about the start of this year. My involvement is probably, there's two main overarching areas, I guess. The first area is giving it the scientific rigour and underpinning, using the research knowledge that we've gathered over the last few decades in sports psychology, but particularly in endurance sports and in triathlon, and to feed that into the entire process, really from start to finish, in terms of the design, but also the use and application of this technology. And I guess that feeds into the second part of my role is having an eye, if you like, on how are we going to use this information from various angles, from the athlete's angle, the coach's approach, and also the sports psychologist, and how we can use this technology as a stimulus to enhance the relationships between those individuals and enhance their practice going forward. So yeah, there's the scientific underpinning, and then there's also the practical application.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Mike, sort of touching on the genome, but also some of the other innovation-based work that you do. If we're not already the best triathlon nation in the world, then we're either very close to it or we're going to be it. I'm sure you would probably tell us that we definitely are already. Can you give us a kind of overview of some of the other things that you do around innovation and how the Athlete Genome kind of can sit alongside that?
Yeah, definitely. So, as I said earlier, innovation is one strand of a wider science and medicine program that we run. But within innovation, we really split that down into three specific areas of work. You've got equipment, behavior change, we call it, and then something specific around the games that you're targeting. So just working back to front, it's been pretty well publicized for Tokyo, the challenges that we've got there in terms of the unique climate that we're going to be competing in. So massive heat and humidity challenges. And for the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a huge body of work gone into interventions and tools that we can use to ultimately try and keep athlete core temperature as low as possible, and to stop some of the scenes that you will have seen with people like Callum Hawkins at the Commonwealth Games, where ultimately they get to a tipping point, and collapse midway through a race. It's a 2-hour race in an extremely complex, very hot, very humid part of the world. And if we don't do a good job of it, we will genuinely miss out on medals. So that's one very specific strand relating to the games. But what runs through everything that we do is also around equipment. So this is the kind of sexy stuff and the people that get really excited about usually. So be that bikes, be that specific parts of pedals, for example, aero equipment, tri-bars, wind tunnel testing, helmets, suits. There's all sorts and all manner of different physical equipment that we are innovating on a relatively regular basis. And that's not necessarily something that we take on ourselves. We work with our individual athlete sponsors, be that Scott or Specialized or SRAM, whoever it might be, to do some innovations in that field. And again, whilst that's really important, that's only one strand, and it's probably not the strand that's actually going to make the biggest difference for us moving forwards. The really biggest difference for us will be innovation around behavior change. That's really where the Athlete Genome comes into play. It's getting a much better understanding of how the physical nature of the sport that we understand so well interacts with the cognitive, mental nature of the sport, and getting people to understand that and being able to attenuate their behavior, being able to predict the impact on certain behaviors and how that interacts with their physical outputs for us is enormous. And that area of innovation for us, though, is very much at the start. It's not very well understood, and the Athlete Genome is very much kind of at the vanguard of what's going on there, really, to help us drive forward the things that we think are ultimately going to make the biggest difference in terms of innovation in Paris, LA, and then the Olympics and Paralympics after that.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because the psychological element is clearly never as visible as some of the equipment or the sexy stuff that you say, but just as, if not more important, in finding those gains. Charlie, I'm going to ask you about some of the cutting edge technology that's a part of the tool. Terms like machine learning and AI. Could you talk us through some of those, please?
Yeah, so essentially, without going too far into the world of AI, AI is generally considered to be the biggest technology revolution since the introduction of mainframe computers. And it's being used by commercial organizations as well as sport now, obviously, to transform the speed and quality of the work traditionally done by humans. And there are some really obvious examples of where that's happening in terms of designing manufacturing parts for cars or spaceships, finding patterns, and this is where the link with the equipment will come in for sure. Finding patterns that accelerate analysis and understanding of the nature of problems, which is where we're focused on here, and ultimately helping making decisions in real time using potentially thousands of different kind of data inputs. And within the general field of AI, there's an emerging trend around emotional AI. And this is a technology that really is focused on helping businesses capture emotional reactions in real time, be that analyzing facial expressions, decoding voice patterns, scanning emails for the tone of language, monitoring eye movements, neurological immersion, all sorts of things are being used there. And that is allowing companies to understand better their customers at a whole new level. And it's no different for the Athlete Genome in the context of the elite sport. If you look at the research, Gartner predicts that, Gartner being a major research company in this space, predicts that by 2022, 10% of personal devices will have emotional AI capabilities. That's just a couple of years from now, either on the device or in the cloud, which is up from less than 1% in 2018. So very significant move in this direction. And you know, to quote Mike Backham, that the Athlete Genome is definitely at the vanguard of this. And so in the world of elite sport, while the value of sports psychology is well understood, current practices are clearly very effective, but they're also, at the individual level, they're constrained by a number of factors, including access to a sports psychologist, not everyone has that, the frequency and timeliness of conversations with those qualified individuals, and also the data that's available to support those discussions. So what we're doing essentially with the Athlete Genome, and many of you are likely to be using it, I'm sure, because we've got around 200 active users now from this community. What we're doing is essentially taking in voice recordings, using the computer to transcribe those voice recordings, identifying the cognitive state. So let's call it the emotions being expressed is the easiest way of summarizing it. And then working out from the combinations whether that's positive, neutral, or negative from a sports, from a physiological output perspective, a performance perspective. And then ultimately the vision is to start to predict the impact of an athlete's cognitive state today and the impact on their physical performance tomorrow. And that's the phase of the work that we're in at the moment. So your help in using the tool is absolutely critical, because with any kind of data science problem, volume of reliable data is the key barrier.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, in a moment, Charlie, after a couple more questions, I'm going to ask you to show us a little bit more of the detail about how the tool works, kind of step by step, but I'll come back to that in a second. One more question for you, Dr. Fletcher. I'm interested, as I say, you're the only one that sits outside of the British Triathlon Accenture bubble looking outside in at this. How do you see this fitting within the wider context of sport, and what other such innovations are going on in this realm?
Well, quite simply, I see it very much as right at the cutting edge and very innovative, and it quite frankly, it's the reason why I got involved, was when Charlie outlined the vision for the project and also the use of the technology. It was really an opportunity that I couldn't turn down, and over the last 6 months, it's been really fascinating and exciting to work with different colleagues from within sport, but also outside of sport, to try and progress the project. And you know, I've been based at Loughborough University the last 13 years. I've been based in sports psychology as a profession for the last 20 years. And I don't think it's hyperbole or overstatement to say it's one of the most ambitious projects that I've seen in this area. It's certainly one of the most exciting that I've been involved with, and the potential and some of the steps that we've already taken moving forward has really spoken towards that. I'll just reel off a couple of the really key innovations. One, for example, is the day-to-day monitoring of athletes' psychological state. That's pretty unheard of. I mean, the best we've done so far is a few questionnaires given out by sports psychologists, which have got their own drawbacks and limitations, whereas this technology is much more athlete-friendly, less intrusive. The daily monitoring itself helps us to track changes over time. The use of the technology to provide immediate feedback to athlete coach and sports psychologist, again, is pretty unheard of, frankly. And then, as Charlie was saying, the direction of travel to looking at the relationships between the psychological state and some of these key physiological and performance metrics again, that's being looked at in different ways, but not at this fine-grained level. So yeah, frankly, I think it's really, really innovative and exciting.
That's great to hear, and like I say, it's always nice to hear that from someone that's outside of the bubble. We all believe in it, and it's great to hear that you do too. So, Charlie, if you're ready, I'm going to start screen sharing some of the slides you wanted to talk through. As a reminder to everyone else, if you have any questions based on what we've talked about already or what we're going to talk about, don't forget to feed them into the chat, or if you're more than welcome to read them out yourself later. So I will start screen sharing now, Charlie.
Fantastic. So look, just to build on what Dave was saying there, I mean, obviously what we're doing, we believe, is new and different. What we're trying to understand is the relationship between cognitive state, so how someone feels, and the athletic performance. And obviously what we are trying to do at a number of levels is understand the general patterns in aggregate, so across all of the 200 or so active users that we have from this community, and then ultimately to be able to build machine learning algorithms, which we're doing at the moment, to start to understand the patterns in that data between cognitive state and athletic performance, and I'll come on to what I mean by athletic performance in a second in terms of the data, and once we have built those models that understand those patterns, we can start taking it to the next level. The first level is to make a general prediction, if you like, based on the aggregate data of how, if someone is exhibiting certain emotions or cognitive state, what impact that is likely to have on their physical performance based on the aggregate of all of the other athletes, because there are similarities between athletes as well as differences. But then clearly, once we've done that, we can start to look to take that analysis down to the individual level, because we're all different, we all respond differently. So a cognitive state for one individual, which might be considered neutral or negative, might actually generate a positive, have a positive impact on their athletic performance, and it might be the reverse for somebody else. And so we understand that doing this at aggregate is only a stepping stone to doing it at the individual level, and being able to predict that. And what's the objective is to understand those relationships and put the athlete in a situation where they can be proactive about identifying those cognitive states that have a negative impact and correcting them to maximize the positive. So if we look at the slide you've got, it's the training sessions graph, and this is the entry point. Essentially, it's where you see your sessions, and typically the data is drawn from training peaks as to when you have actually trained. They appear as grey dots. There are multicolored dots at the moment, but the first one that you can see there, being pointed out now, is grey. And that's where you can create an audio recording. So you click on the dot, and you get to you then record your audio, your reflections on how that specific session went, obviously after the event. And then if you go on to slide 2, please, Stu, the recording audio data view then shows the athlete about to submit their recording. The AI, as I explained, then analyzes the words that are used and identifies the dominant cognitive state, which has been refined with Dr. Fletcher's help, Dave Fletcher's help, because we need to have a series of cognitive states that speak to athletes and elite athletes specifically. So if we move on then to slide 3 to keep it moving quite swiftly, we're back at the training sessions, and then this slide with the multicolored dots makes a little bit more sense, because what the dots represent, as you can see at the key at the bottom, is the dominant cognitive state exhibited based on the recording after each individual session. So you can see from this view over time how your cognitive state is changing. If you move on to slide 4, what we're doing then is, and actually this is a scroll down when you're actually in the application, we're representing those dominant cognitive states in aggregate across multiple different time periods, so you can see how it is changing over time. And I say you, the athlete, but obviously this is aimed equally at coaches and at sports psychs. And what isn't shown here, but if you click on the down arrow opposite swim, bike and run, you get the same view for each of the 3 disciplines. Moving then on to the state trends graph, which is a further scroll down in the live application. What this shows is how cognitive state changes over time. And what's interesting about this is that you can toggle, you can isolate, basically by clicking on the checkboxes at the bottom, different emotions and when they have exhibited themselves over time. But also you can isolate specific disciplines or have all 3. And indeed, you can isolate fatigue, fitness, and effort, TSS. So you can see different views depending on how you want to look at it. But ultimately, this very clearly shows that there is a transition from joy and confidence, which is the green and the blue, the light blue, let's call it, through to fear, and tentative and frustration, the more negative sentiments over time, the period, and that transition happens on this chart between 10th of May and the 24th of May. I'm assuming this is test and dummy data, but otherwise it's highly anonymized, but it shows a realistic picture of what could be happening. So if we move on to the mindset profile graph, if you look at the top, you've got the mindset summary tab, and we've now clicked to the one on the right around mindset interpretation in the application. What this starts to do is to provide a so what around the dominant states. So it's a psychology-driven interpretation of the combinations of cognitive states that are being represented. And if you look at the wheel here, above the line in the center, if you like, above satisfied and frustration are broadly what would be considered positive cognitive states, and below the line are negative. And what this is showing in this illustrative example for a specific time frame, the 1st of January to the 1st of January, but you can choose multiple different time frames, that broadly the profile across 2 different sessions was positive. If we move on to the next slide, you can show that we can actually do a comparison of that, and again, isolating different disciplines to understand from that same view how it might compare between different time periods. And that's of course important if you're looking to compare different training phases, or after changing a coach, or anything that changes in your training plan. If we move on to the tipping points comparison now, the next slide, what this then shows is the significant changes in cognitive state over time, only the significant ones. This is all about the changes. And whether or not they coincide with these stars here, which are identified as key events that you have recorded. So they're manually recorded. And it allows you to see in the context of key events, maybe an injury or some other personal event like moving house, and or very stressful, or less time to train, or whatever it is, how the dominant cognitive states change over time, and you can overlay that on the key physiological metrics, in this example, TSS. But of course, we have all the physiological data from Training Peak, so hundreds of data points that get flowed through there. If we move on to the data flag table, which is, again, another scroll down here within mindset interpretation, we're pretty much at the bottom of the application. What this data flag table shows is, for a specific date range, where there were significant changes, and whether or not they are considered by sports psychology to be positive or neutral or negative changes, whether there are any outliers in the data, so something weird happened. And what the application allows you to currently do is to capture an action, because this is a table that you would want to, as it says at the top, review and discuss with your coach or sports psych. And then if you go to the next slide, the data flag action slide, you can see that for each one of these, it provides a guidance as to what those combinations of dominant cognitive states might be indicating from a sports psychology perspective, and allows you and your coach and sports psych or whatever to complete an action plan by clicking on Add Action. If we just go back to the previous slide, please, Stu. The application currently focuses on actions, but what I mentioned at the outset was that the ambition here is to start focusing on, okay, what could this mean based on the wider data sets for your athletic performance, based on some of the cognitive states and the ratings that we've applied here. And while there are parallels to be drawn from the aggregate, from a whole range of athletes, for example, Garmin does this with Garmin Insights. The real objective is to get this down to the individual level. So for Sarah Scarlett, based on analysis of her data, what does an increase in frustration and confidence as a combination do to her normalized power on the bike, for example, over time? That's the vision here. And those predictions, if you like, will replace or add to what is currently on the right there around actions. I'm going to stop the kind of demo just by saying the vision for this is, yes, to understand the relationship between cognitive state and athletic performance at the individual level, but it's also about providing a scalable tool to use with a significant number of athletes to bring together coaches, athletes, and sports psychologists who may be, obviously working remotely in many instances, so that we can have that more collaborative conversation. And this is the platform that is intended to help do that. There are others, of course, like Training Peaks and all sorts of physiological analysis, but there aren't many, if any, that do this around mindsets, interpretation, cognitive state that we've talked about here. I'm going to stop there, Steve.
Thank you, Charlie. I hope everyone found that as fascinating as I did. It really is, as has been repeated, it's really cutting edge stuff at the forefront of what we're trying to achieve in this area. So thank you for talking us through it. If anyone wants to revisit any of those slides, by the way, like I said, it is recorded, this session, so we'll send it out afterwards, so you're more than welcome to revisit that and have a look. Thank you to a couple of you who have submitted questions at the moment, by the way. We'll get to those when we come to the end, so thank you. Mike, British Triathlon's involvement, we've had input from yourself, a couple of your staff, and obviously our age group community that are with us today. Can you talk us through the kind of testing process and how we've got to where we are today?
Well, the critical thing for anybody that's worked, I'm sure David Fletcher will probably be able to attest to this. When you're working with athletes for whom it's their full-time job to be an athlete, you've got to, and you're looking to try and create something innovative or something that you ultimately want to work with your athletes, you've got to get a tool to a place where it is seamless, where they will enjoy using it, and where you can demonstrate the value. So right from the outset for us, having both age group involvement, but also our coaching staff and some of our science staff who are used to working with athletes on a daily basis to make sure the tool right from the starting point was aimed with those kind of outward achievements in mind. It's really critical for us. So there was a small group of age group athletes that were involved in kind of the first iteration of this tool, really trying to test it to see whether just the functionality worked, whether it became something that was relatively natural, and how easy it was to use more than anything else. And that's obviously before now we've got to the point where we've got, I think it was a couple of hundred people using it, where it actually then becomes more about the data that it spits out the other end and the insight that it's telling us. And we've therefore had people involved right from the outset of just making sure the tool is functional, to the point where we're at now, where actually the tool is definitely functional. You can see actually the amount of development that's gone into the slides that Charlie just demonstrated. So that functionality remains when the insight is starting to show us really valuable, because there's no point having any insight if actually the tool is clunky. It's not something that we know to demonstrate value to our athletes. So we've been involved right from the outset. We had 3 or 4 performance athletes doing similar things to the age group athletes right at the start, in terms of recording their own sentiment, alongside obviously their normal physiological recording of their training data. We've had, our head of science, I need to head of science then, but head of performance science services involved right from the outset, working very closely with Charlie. I've been involved very much in the background, trying to sense check some of the direction of travel. And it's actually been a really collaborative approach, which generally isn't my experience often in building tools such as this. So it's actually been a really positive move, and one that gives me a lot more confidence, actually, that when we get to a point of getting our elite athletes using this on a much more blanket basis, that it's not something we're really going to have to work hard in convincing them to do.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I'm not gonna name check and embarrass the person on this call, but there is one that I can see who's been involved since the very, very beginning. When we launched the Accenture Performance Academy last year, and there was literally eight age groupers on a testing group, and that person I know has been an absolute stalwart and a hero of the tool since then. So you know who you are. So thank you, Mike. One more thing from you. What's as succinct as you can phrase it, what's the big dream for you around psychology and innovation and the potential of something like this?
Well, Charlie really stole my thunder on that, but in reality, it's something that can help us predict when things are going right and when things are going wrong ahead of time. You know, it sounds a little bit Minority Report-ish, but, you know, in our world, if we can, you know, get a better understanding and a genuinely predictive tool that helps us stop injuries happening before they happen, that helps us, and injuries usually happen by and large because of overtraining, being blunt, in triathlon. If we can have a tool that helps us to predict whether an athlete is going to do well or otherwise at a competition that they're competing at, you know, the excitement there is enormous. You know, I paint you a picture of us going into an Olympic Games or even going into a selection event for an Olympic Games. We know, you know, 7-8 weeks out, the sentiment, the mindset those athletes are in, and how that impacts on the likely performance outcome of our athletes at a games or at a selection event, whatever it might be. The insight that gives us to be able to prepare our athletes in the right way and to enhance their chances of winning on the day is absolutely huge. But, you know, Charlie articulated, you know, we've got a bit of a way to go to get there yet, but undoubtedly that would be the dream for us. Great.
And David, to bring you in on that, I suppose that's your excitement looking at it across sports. We're obviously coming at this from a triathlon perspective right now, but if we could apply that across all British sports and have a better understanding of mindset, sentiment, performance preparation, etc., that would give us a better chance at Olympics and Paralympics, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've known for decades that the psychology affects both training and competition, but probably what we've not done as well or as effectively or systematically is monitor psychology and train psychological aspects. And I think that this is this project is taking that to the next level. And the other thing that I'd add as well is hopefully what it's doing is taking out some of the chance, if you like, in this area of preparation. We've seen really radical advances in areas such as physiology, sleep, nutrition, the way that that's been monitored and analysed. A lot of the aspects of chance are being taken out of things, but psychology's probably lagged behind a little bit in those areas. But now, hopefully, with this technology, the way it's coming through, what it's doing is it's, well, as Mike was saying, it's hopefully flagging a few areas before they become problems and raising those. And it's the beauty of the technology is it's virtually in real time. You can get that feedback that day. And when you actually use the interface, what's really quite neat about it is the coach can have all of their athletes and toggle through them quite quickly and scroll through in a matter of minutes. They can see some of the areas of strength and some of the areas for development. And one thing I will add as well, I mean, Charlie and Mike have given fantastic overviews already, but the one thing I want to add is that it's not there to replace a coach or a psychologist or give all of the answers. It's there very much to act as a stimulus for conversation, a stimulus for debate. And it may be some areas don't necessarily go anywhere, but what it will do is flag some key areas that I think coaches and athletes and psychologists should be focused on. As I say, in psychology, we've been a little bit reliant on conversations here, discussions there, maybe one athlete says something to a coach and maybe you need to look at this. And what we're trying to do is, as I say, take out some of the chance there speed things up and cut through some of the information to focus on the really meaningful things that can affect performance.
Stu, sorry, I'll just jump in. One thing I would say, just to really kind of hammer home the point David was just saying, is certainly in our world, and I would assume the same for lots of the age groupers that are on the call now, you know, the coach is king or the coach is queen in this. You know, they are the one who is responsible for pulling everything together and making the performance life or death decision as to whether to pull back, whether to push hard. And they are absolutely critical decisions that can make or break, and decisions that are often made in the moment in a single training session or in a week or in a training block that can often make or break an athlete's career. And the more insight we give them and the more tools that we give them, and particularly the more objective insight we give them, the more likely they are able to be able to make the right decision. And as Charlie said, as David said, with psychology up until now, that has often had to rely with the coaches on the right conversation happening at the right time between psychologist, athlete, and coach. And so unless you have a one-to-one psychologist-coach ratio, which is never going to be happening in the world that I live in, there's a very real chance that the really, really important piece of insight that might say to a coach, right, you just need to actually pull back a little bit here, will fall through the cracks. And all of a sudden, the opportunity to make the right decision goes out the window. And that genuinely might be the thing that either stops or makes an athlete win an Olympic or Paralympic medal. So if we get this right, and you know, there's no doubt that, as Charlie said, we need more data, and this is the kind of next phase. But if we get this right and we can get this down to an individual level, you know, the opportunity to provide that level of insight and to give coaches confidence in making those decisions is probably the most critical part.
Thank you, Mike, for that. I'm going to actually, so we're going to kind of come to the end of our panel discussion phase now and bring in some of the great questions that we've had submitted. And I'm sure there's a few more that people have got. There's been quite a lot of questions, actually, so thank you for that. If we don't get to any of them today, we will do our very, very best to answer them after the call via the inbox.
Stu?
Yes.
Stu, if I may, it would be really good to hear from Dave, if that's possible, Dave, just around some of the insights that you think, that these are preliminary insights, but the insights that you think are worthy of further exploration and discussion within the project, to give people a flavour of the type of thing that, you know, we're looking at the moment. Is it, you know, just a couple of minutes on something really illustrative?
Yes, no, I can do that. Okay, so just as a way of introduction, I think as Charlie was saying earlier, the summary of the mindset over periods of time and the ability to compare that across, say, the build up to the previous Olympic Games to this Olympic Games is one area that's particularly insightful. Another is these the turning points, which are the significant changes, and also the different flags that we can allocate to different sets of profiles of states and how that relates to various physiological and performance metrics. And that's that kind of early warning indicator that we mentioned earlier. And some of the data that we've been crunching in this area is indeed suggesting there are certain patterns or characteristics that appear over time, which are associated with more desirable physiological metrics versus less desirable metrics associated with the bike, swim and the run. It's really fascinating, actually. To keep things kind of brief, there's some areas that are very much corresponding with what we know in psychology around areas such as excitement, confidence, those areas which we know are quite positive psychological states that link with physiological variables in certain ways. But what we're also uncovering, and this is the beauty of the machine learning, where it can crunch a significant amount of data across multiple participants and indeed across time as well. What we're seeing is some quite interesting combinations where we're getting, I don't want to get too technical, but what we're getting is a combination of what we call both positive and negatively valenced emotions. Now, the word valenced is just a fancy word for saying basically how it makes you feel. Does it make you feel good or bad? Now, that doesn't necessarily correspond with performance. So anxiety as an emotion is a negatively valenced emotion that we wouldn't want to carry around every day, all day. but under certain circumstances, and indeed crucially in certain combinations, that anxiety can actually be a stimulus to better performance. So one example is where you have a manageable level of anxiety, which is negative emotion, but with high levels of confidence, which is a positive psychological state. That puts you in a really quite robust situation to perform well, because what anxiety can do is focus your attention, and it can help you exert more effort. And that, of course, is particularly relevant in sport like triathlon, where pain's a factor. So if you get these certain combinations of states and psychological aspects in the week or the period of time leading up to a competition, then we know that that's quite facilitative to performance. And of course, we know the reverse as well. And as Charlie was saying earlier, you know, the more data that we collect around this, both at a group level, but also at an individual level, we can begin to individualize this and enhance the coaching. So the coach could sit down with the athlete a week before the competition and say, compared to the last major competition, here's how your different states are fluctuating in a different way. So that's just one example. We're currently sifting through, there was 28 main combinations that we're scrutinizing in some detail at the moment.
That's right. And that's really helpful, Dave. I mean, one of the things that, as we scrutinize those 28, that stuck out for me is that you have positive combinations, which Dave talked about, which typically drive enhanced athletic performance. And obviously you'd expect negative to drive more negative, with the exception around anxiety that Dave was talking about. But one of the things that was really interesting that came out is that essentially extremes of both positive and negative tend to result overall in a negative. So there's a line that you cross with positive emotions that result in negative athletic performance, and you know, so that was kind of interesting. And then obviously combinations of positive and negative states, specific states, like frustration and sadness, even though they're combined with really positive combinations, tend to result in a negative. So what it allows you to do is to identify those cognitive states that are going to undermine athletic performance, irrespective of anything else. And you know, obviously we're looking to predict that in the way that we talked about. But Dave, that's a really helpful summary. Thank you. Stu, back to you.
Sorry, just one other very quick thing. Very much the focus of the project has been on the link between cognitive states and performance. But actually the power of this tool as well to look at the general well-being and mental health of athletes is another side benefit, if you like, of the project. Is you know, the area of well-being and mental health is growing in importance, not just in elite sport but across society. And I think, although we haven't specifically looked at this yet, that's another benefit of this technology, is that if athletes are struggling with their well-being or their mental health, or it might be burnout and things like that, hopefully we can, again, what we were saying earlier, we can flag that sooner rather than later and get those athletes very bespoke help in that way too.
Yeah.
Great, thank you guys. This is one of those really, really interesting debates that I'm sure we as a group could probably talk about for hours on end. I'm going to throw to some of the questions that we've had submitted, because we've had quite a lot of good ones. I'm going to start with a really easy one because I can answer it myself, which is, how do you sign up? Thank you, James. The simple answer to this one is you email triathlon@accenture.com, and we'll clarify this in the follow-up email that you'll get today. You email that email address and they will kind of talk you through the process for signing up and being a part of it moving forwards. Like the guys said, we've had 100, 200 people on the tool so far, and we want to make sure we're getting as much data from you guys as possible. So any sign-ups are more than welcome. I've had a question from Brian Elliott, and I'm going to kind of ask two questions at once here because it's similar to another one, which is around the plan for coaches to be able to access and use this through Training Peaks to use with their athletes. So Mike, this kind of touches on the point you made about coach is king, because there's another question in there as well, which is touching on the coach is king comment. What about self-coached athletes? What about the age groupers on here that don't have a coach currently? Which was from Paul Birch, so thank you, Paul.
So, yeah, I mean, my comment about coach being king is because certainly in the area of the sport that I operate in, there's so many inputs, there's so much risk involved that such a huge multidisciplinary team to manage, that our philosophy is very much that we want to make sure that our athletes, wherever possible, are not self-coached. That's not in any way to suggest that there can't be a hugely successful self-coached athletes. Alistair Brownlee at the moment, Johnny Brownlee being exact examples of those. But in the main, there are so many things that athletes need to think about that we would obviously always try and encourage there to be a lead person managing and directing a program. But the principles ultimately apply in the same way, right? If you are a coach leading an athletes program, or you are an athlete leading your own program, having access to the insight and the information that you're being given is critical, and possibly even more so for a self-coached athlete, because actually it's much more likely you're going to get blinded by how your body feels, or by what's gone before, or what other people are doing, because it's much more difficult to stay objective when you're coaching yourself. So having this extra level of objective insight potentially may well actually be even more beneficial to the self-coached athlete.
Great, thank you, Mike. I'm going to ask a question from William Reed now. Thank you, William. Very interesting. I work in a parallel area with similar diagnostic capability. The big issue we have is it's like looking in a rear view mirror. So how do we act on the insights, and can it predict what the result could be if we make relevant changes to training or attitude? Who wants to answer that one?
So I can have a go at that. I mean, that is really the objective of this tool. It's so the rear view mirror is inevitably a little bit like anything. I mean, Training Peaks has that problem in it as well, in the sense that you're looking at past performance and you're trying to make a judgment as to how to adjust your training program based on that, based on a range of inputs, of which that's one. The opportunity here, though, if you were to leave the tool just as a visualization of cognitive state changes on athletic performance, then it is only a rearview mirror, an important rearview mirror, but only that. If, however, as we've talked about on this call, you're looking to understand the relationship between cognitive state and athletic performance, to be able to predict the impact of cognitive state on athletic performance in the future, both in aggregate for all athletes and ultimately for an individual athlete, then you've got a crystal ball, right? I mean, the simple reality is, as Dave said, this is not going to provide every answer. It's not going to be uber prescriptive, but it is going to provide a forward view of what could happen if the current cognitive state persists, and therefore that gives people the tools with which to adjust, intervene, if you like, to change the cognitive state to one where, for that individual, it will optimize your athletic performance. And individual is important because we're all different. So what might work for me wouldn't work for you, etc., etc.
I can probably give a bit more of a kind of parallel analogy. I see the athlete genome in that sense very similar to what we do around predicting injury. So we know within our sport that bone stress injuries and tendon loading issues are the biggest problem for us. And the only way we've been able to get back on top of that is looking in the rearview mirror and looking at when those injuries have occurred and what was happening around that in terms of training prescription, in terms of physical load. So we have now been able to put in place a protocol around bone stress injuries and around tendon loading issues that ultimately looks at a bunch of markers and identifying what those consistent markers are. And when those markers tip over a certain level, we would identify that, speak to the coach, and then either pull people back, change training prescription, do different things, whatever it might be, maybe even stop people racing because they're an early sign of a bone stress injury potentially coming along. I see the athlete genome in exactly the same way, but for psychological load. It's not going to say Minority Report style, right, this thing's happened, so therefore in 6 weeks' time, this thing's definitely going to happen. It is an indicator of a potential need to do something different or to push on or whatever it might be. And so I think actually just by learning from what happens in the past, in the same way that all of you as athletes will know what worked for you from a training prescription wise for the last 10 years or whatever of training, you know, you will do what worked for you in the past and what didn't in the future. So I think actually it's a very, very similar approach to how we would operate with injury.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I suppose the additional comment I would make is that it's also about the positive. So it's also about understanding at the individual level what the optimum cognitive state is for that individual and trying to bring that about. It's not just avoiding negative outcomes, it's about maximizing positive outcomes. So one input of many, but it's definitely both sides of the coin.
Great, thank you guys. I'm gonna mention a couple of they're not questions as such, but a couple of interesting comments. One of which, because I just think it's quite funny. John Harley kind of mentioned a story in his comment about his relationship with his coach and therefore the importance around that. And I suppose what this tool does, and he kind of inferred this in his message, is help explain the why behind what your coach is asking you to do. Which kind of represents it quite nicely. And then William Reed made a comment about age group athletes sometimes needing to get slower than everyone else, not necessarily about getting faster, but not getting slower as quickly as your competition. Andy Caldwell asked a great question. Will there be a chance to focus the research on young athletes if they can learn the tools to manage their mental state from an earlier age? Would this have a greater impact later in their career and reduce the issues that may occur? Who wants to take it on?
It's one for you, Dave, I think.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Yeah, absolutely. Great observation. You're not the first one to say something similar, actually, around psychology. I did some work out in Florida at the Bollettieri Tennis Academy, where they've got full-time athletes at age 8, and you're doing the beginnings of sports psychology, if you like, where you're talking about packing your bag appropriately. When do you take the water bottle out your bag? Do you drink enough from your water bottle? All of that, although it's, you know, nutrition and preparation, there's an element of psychology and preparation. So, yeah, so you know, the earlier the better to a large extent. You know, the key thing with age group athletes, as you know, is obviously enjoyment, correct technique, learning the technical aspects of the sport. So yeah, I think there is definite scope to introduce this in an appropriate way with youth level athletes, and indeed use that to inform how we effectively work with them. And as has been mentioned a couple of times, that coach athlete relationship is really key. So how we can use this technology to enhance that relationship and enhance those conversations between athletes and coaches, but also the parent and the psychologist around that, depending on the specifics of the context and the relationships. I see that as a good thing.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, guys, it's 59 minutes past, so I'm going to ask you all for a really quick, like 1 or 2 word response each. What is the number one benefit, tangible benefit, that someone using this tool could take away? Let's start with Charlie, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say understanding the cognitive state that best gives you the best performance outcome. So put it in the positive.
Great. Mike, from a performance perspective, your end?
For me, it's simple. It is just having greater insight and another tool to help you make really great decisions.
And David?
A greater awareness all round about the psychological state of the athlete, how that affects them, how that affects their relationship with their coach, and how it ultimately affects their performance and training and competition.
Lovely, thank you guys. Sorry, I put you on the spot there with a succinct answer about a very detailed topic, so thank you for that. Guys, thank you very much for all your questions, and thank you very much for dialing in today. If I didn't get to your questions, I'm going to make a promise to you, which is that I've saved the chat. I'm going to submit all of those questions and all of that feedback, which has been really helpful to the team, and we'll make sure we come back to each of you individually. So thank you for your contributions. Sorry if we didn't get round to you. If you are interested, as I say, in taking part in this, then email triathlon@accenture.com. You'll get a message this afternoon with a reminder of that. So yeah, thank you very much for joining. Thank you to Mike, Charlie and David for joining and providing some really, really great insight. So I'll ask you all to join me in saying thanks and goodbye to everyone now.
Thanks very much.
Guys.
Cheers.